happens, right? Things happen. We call it an inevitable delay, and there's purposeful delay, and there's delay due to emotional problems. But then there's this thing called procrastination. So you're facing a task, and you go, "Oh, I hate this task. It's so boring. I resent doing it. It's so difficult. I'm anxious." You pick your favorite negative emotion. There are lots. We become our own worst enemy at that point. Procrastination becomes a bad habit. So how do we get past that?
The key to the high performance life is understanding all the things that can get in the way of the things we actually want. And Tim, I'm so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's really my pleasure. Really excited about what you're doing.
And you have been in university and teaching and studying procrastination for so long, but I wanted to start with our conversation that, every time we do a podcast, we have a little bit of a preemptive conversation, and sometimes you have to be careful because the good stuff really starts to come early. And with you, it came early. And you mentioned that you were you moved to a separate room because they're doing some heavy construction outside, and you could hear the vehicles, and we don't hear it now, which is awesome. But you said you were a bit imbalanced. And I said, speaking of imbalance, I backed into my own garage door, living the high performance life in quotations right now. All because, I made a dumb mistake, but I happened to touch the button as I was thinking, oh, I haven't opened the garage door. Let me touch the button and proceed to back out at the exact same time. And it was very, very quick. I stopped immediately. Luckily, there was no damage to the car, but I just knocked the garage door off and spent about 20 minutes fixing it. So we were talking about life's imbalance, and it really got me to say, why did this happen today, besides me making a really stupid mistake? But my wife and my son are out of town. I took on not only the normal routine I do, and I'm extremely disciplined and routine driven, I did the things she normally does, which she does all this before she goes to work. She walks the dog. She cleans up at the house. She does all these things, right? So I do all of them this morning, and I'm completely disheveled. And that one lack of discipline, that one thing that changed my schedule, really had a difficulty. It was really a difficulty for me this morning. And so we started talking, and then you started talking. I want to pause and just introduce the story. You were giving some advice to your daughter this morning, and just catch everybody up on that conversation, because that's worth starting right there.
Well, yes, I love the story about your morning. And this morning, mine got off to a strange start too, in the sense that we're having flooding in our area right now. And the children at the high school are asked to be prepared to help fill sandbags for one of their periods. And naturally, the principal suggested they bring gloves and they wear good boots. And so my daughter was keen to do it. My son was a little reluctant, but off they go with their gloves. And I didn't notice it, but I didn't register with people. My daughter left with Birkenstocks on. And about 10 minutes later, I realized, what's she doing? Like, those are really expensive sandals, and they're not going to protect your feet. In fact, at least you'd have closed-toed shoes. Anyhow, I said to my wife, what's with Laurel? Like, and she said, oh, that's her ADHD. I said, no, that's her lack of strategy. Right? Like of course, we're neurodiverse. We all have our limitations. And she knows one of hers is a bit forgetfulness, but you have to write these things down. And she said, what do you mean? I said, I write everything down during my day. And she said, well, how do you keep up with that? I said, okay, I look at my calendar, because otherwise I'll never remember what I'm doing next. So yesterday, there are a few things I thought that's for tomorrow. I put them in my calendar. I know where they are, and I keep track. And it's essential. It's what lets me do the things that I want to do. And, what's really interesting for me is that some people would say, well, I don't want that calendar to own me. No, it's the opposite. I own the calendar. It's my tool. It's my tool to ensure that I live the life I want to live. And at the end of the day, I can do a forensic audit, or the end of the week, or the end of a year, and say, what's the life I'm living? It's right there. It's this picture. It's this wonderful picture. And so I'm constantly trying to teach my children that. But a lot of people are reluctant because they think, oh, it's going to take so much discipline. It's going to drag me down. Just the opposite. In fact, it feeds me. But that's how my morning started too. And of course, I've got contractors here, and they're making noise, and my regular studio is much too close to them. So I'm up in my son's bedroom, and I've set things up here, and here we are. We're making it work.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the high performance life if it wasn't imperfect. And I think one of the challenges we all face in in wanting to be better at whatever it is. And I know that you started studying procrastination in the 1990s, and you have devoted your career to something that can help everybody in any level of their life, from their families to their professional life. And it doesn't matter what happens, life is going to get in the way. And you even talk about that in the beginning of your book, which I found extremely interesting, because there's a delineation between procrastination and just life getting in the way sometimes, right?
Yeah. Delay happens, right? Things happen. We call it an inevitable delay. And there's purposeful delay. And there's delay due to emotional problems. But then there's this thing called procrastination. And that's what interests me, because we become our own worst enemy at that point. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I was pretty keen to join you because of the title of this podcast, right? The High Performance Life. And I'll tell you, I was a very reluctant consultant, and I got asked by some such high performing individuals to come and talk with them. I thought, what in the world would I tell these people? They just eat it up because they know how they can fine tune things. They know that things get in the way, right? And so I found that sometimes the very best of, quote, audiences, and it's more of a relationship than an audience, but
right.
That's, we start with a talk, but it becomes a conversation. But in any case, this notion of high performance, it fits us all. Yeah.
Yeah. And much like your daughter, what's funny about life is I felt like, coming from a pretty disciplined environment. I went to Catholic school. I had nuns. I mean, almost most of my years I had nuns. The discipline was intense.
Yeah.
And I really thought I hated it. And then I got to high school and I let loose a little bit of the discipline. And by the time I got to college, I started to implement some of the things that were disciplined. Then you wake up and you own your own business and you're building and developing something much bigger than yourself. And you realize the very comfort that you had in the disciplined environment was the freedom that you thought was the opposite. So when we're young, it's that discipline is a bad word. It's uncomfortable. It's mom and dad giving us bad advice. You could be the #1 expert in the world and are, as far as I'm concerned, in procrastination. And yet your own children will say, Dad,
Yes.
you don't understand.
Oh, yeah. And the irony there is that I think it was last year, my daughter's friends at school nominated her for the Procrastination Award. I said, Laurel, come on, you're killing me. And it's so true. It's a tough act to sell. Yeah. But in any case, it is what it is. We're all human. And she has to grow into those things. And if we spend a minute here talking about teens, well, of course, their prefrontal cortex is not yet developed. That's the last part of the brain ontogenetically that develops, say, age 25. We're going to see more maturity there. But phylogenetically, it's the last part of the brain that was added on. And so that's part of the story here about why we procrastinate, this limbic system overtaking the prefrontal cortex. So we've got this emotional brain, we'll oversimplify here a little bit, this emotional brain hijacks the thinking brain. So the planfulness, the executive functions of the prefrontal cortex, well, the amygdala lights up because you have this emotional reaction to a task. So you're facing a task and you go, oh, I hate this task. It's so boring. I resent doing it. It's so difficult. I'm anxious. You pick your favorite negative emotion. There are lots. And of course, what happens then is that we focus on that emotion. It overwhelms us. We no longer are doing anything. We're trying to feel good. And that's my whole story, as you read. It's about giving in to feel good. That procrastination, ironically, I talked about time management and my use of a calendar. Well, procrastination isn't a time management problem. That's a tool for me to be more effective. But what happens is I get to that point in my calendar, and I look at that next task, and I think, well, I sing the procrastinator song. I don't think anything. I don't want to. I don't feel like it. I'll feel more like it tomorrow. There's the lyrics to the procrastinator song.
Yeah.
And we all know it. We can all feel that. And of course, what kicks in then? An emotion coping response. And what's that response? It's avoidance. So that's the long and the short of it. And I think we're going to have to talk around that. But that's the story here about what's happening to my daughter in some ways, right? I'm not going to beat her up. She's just turning 18 this month. Developmentally, she's got lots of things to learn about why strategy is important, like the story you just told. And also she needs to just have some more maturation. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what? Just like the story I started out with, sometimes you could do all the right things and really have the right disciplines, and you still make some mistakes because you get disheveled. And high performers understand anybody. And when I talk about high performers, I love to define this sometimes because really anybody that's doing more than most people think is possible. And it really is. So many moms. I talked about my wife and what she gets done in the day. You know, we joke all the time, like, oh, you're taking care of the dog, you're walking the dog, you're feeding the dog, oh my gosh, just those 3 or 4 things I did this morning derailed me. I do an infrared sauna, I do a cold plunge, I do all these things that help Scott be the best version of himself, so I don't actually blow up. And she does it all and teaches full time and does all the things that we just talked about. My wife is as much of a high performer as I am. And so defining that is key. But high performers have something that's interesting when it comes to procrastination. And I'm really interested in talking about this. And that is, they have a yes problem. They say yes to too many things. And if you're like me and you're listening out there, and so many times you find yourself overwhelmed, and you actually feel like you're procrastinating on something that you just don't have time to do right now, or you haven't clearly defined what's important to you. Can you talk a little bit about that cycle and that challenge that a lot of people that are doing maybe a little bit too much may be experiencing?
Yeah, there's a few ways to go at that. And one of those things is that sometimes people who are habitual procrastinators, so they're using avoidance as a coping mechanism, they say yes to everything as another way of avoiding. They avoid saying no. That's the one thing, disappointing others. Then they can always have too much on the go, and it gives them a self-handicapping excuse. Well, I didn't get that done well because I got all these other things going on. And then on top of all of that, I agree with you completely. They're not focused on what is it that I'm trying to accomplish here? What is it I want to do? What are the important goals for me? And not get caught up in, well, we can go back to even the guru Stephen Covey in that respect, the unimportant, unurgent quadrant of that's really classic time management thing. You're not doing the important, non-urgent stuff that really takes your life forward with the things that you want. So yeah, we can be binging because it's a way of binging can be a procrastination technique. Yeah, which is ironic. Very busy people can still be procrastinating because they're not getting the important stuff done. Yeah.
Yeah. I read it during COVID in the beginning when things were kind of shut down and it was really new. I spent a couple weekends going through old stuff, and I pulled a bunch of stuff out of the attic and organized. I looked at a lot of old letters, and I was reading a letter I had written or my wife had written to me when we were dating, and I was starting to work and she was still in college. And it said, "I know how busy you are, Scott, and I'm hoping it'll slow down soon." And I was reading this, and honestly, emotionally, it was wrecking me, because as I read it, I was like, you are the same as you were 20 something years ago. And you think you've grown so much. And at the end of the day, there's parts of me that have grown so much, but some parts of me that are still always just a little too busy. And
some of that is internal though, too, isn't it? That we don't calm ourselves down internally, and others really pick up on that. Like that wheel inside is spinning so fast. One of the things I had to do to get ready just to be with you today, and I even had to catch myself at the beginning because we had so much fun talking even before we started. We could feel the energy between us. It's just to slow down a little bit because I have to think too, right? And the key word, and you used it actually in the conversation before we started the podcast, is showing up, right? I have to show up for Scott today. I made a commitment to talk to him. That means I have to show up for him. I have to listen to what he has to say. And when we do that, we slow down in an important way. And so it's not always just that we take on too much. It's that we almost like we're catastrophizing inside. But there's this to do and there's that to do. And again, we can go back to some of the tools. The calendar helps because it outsources my thinking. It's written there. I've got the right time for it. I can let go of that right now. I don't have to rehearse it constantly. And it's also about emotion regulation, which again takes me back full circle to, and emotion regulation is the solution to procrastination too. If I'm using avoidance as a coping mechanism, well, aren't there others I could use? Yeah, I could calm down to start with. Like I could take a deep breath right now. And if I do that, and I will, just even that one, I just feel my whole body start to relax. And it changes my conversation with you because I think differently. I do 2 or 3 of those, and now I've engaged the prefrontal cortex again. I reduce the amygdala hijack, right? That's the first strategy I'd start with, that emotion regulation. So being busy, to go back to what you were saying, yeah, you are the same guy you were before in other people's eyes, and some of that is internal, right? And some of it won't go away, like, because it's quote quintessentially Scott.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that that's how you have to be in the world all the time, right? We can act out of character per se. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great awareness. I think it brings up another great value add to any high performance life or thinking, and that is reflection. You know, when you can look back, you mentioned this in the beginning of our conversation where you write everything down. Well, the beautiful thing about writing everything down, and Dr. Ben Hardy and Dan Sullivan wrote a book called The Gap and the Gain, and it talks about how so many entrepreneurs live in the gap, and they constantly are looking at, they kick a 30-yard field goal and they're like, oh, now I can kick a 35, I can kick a 40, I can kick a 50, and the goalposts just keep moving back and back. But what you described is the gain. And when you actually take a few moments to look back at what you've accomplished, you feel good. And so the
Yeah.
very thing that you're often avoiding, which is what you talk about in procrastination, is that feel good moment of tomorrow that never comes.
Yeah. Big time.
It's there is some wins if you're writing it down and you're seeing it. And for me, reflecting on that letter, I was able to say, okay, these are areas I haven't gotten better in. And maybe it's just a high energy part of my personality. You know,
Mhm.
people always think that I'm doing way too much, but if I'm not doing way too much, I
Right.
feel bored.
Right.
So that's ADHD too. We all know that. But at the same time, you know, I'll pause there because I'd love your insight on that. But the reflection and the gain that you look at every day has to help us feel more accomplished and get more done.
Yes, so there's some solid social psychological research, not out of my group, but others, psychologists, that show that when we make progress on a goal, it fuels our well-being. And you have to reflect on the progress you've made, right? To know you've made progress, you have to look at what you've accomplished. And this again is really crucial to anyone who's tuning in, because we're talking about procrastination, is that if you can make a little bit of progress, like prime the pump, that's going to fuel your well-being. We all know the downward spiral of procrastination. The more I put it off, the worse I feel, and the more I put it off. Just a little bit of progress. What's that next action I can do? And if we do that action, we make that bit of progress, we reflect on it, and we go, that feels good. And of course it does. And that's going to fuel your well-being to do more. But then you bring in this present and future self, which is really an important part of the whole story as well. Hal Hirschfield out of UCLA has done some amazing work, and he's got a book coming out in June 2023 called Your Future Self. I've seen it; it's a great read. Hal's a great guy. You should talk with him for sure. But some of his research shows that there's a real discrepancy between present self and future self. We actually think about future self more like a stranger, physiologically, and certainly in terms of how we deal with future self. And in our research, we've shown that if we can think about future self more, we develop more empathy for future self. And that empathy is related to less procrastination. So there's a few things in there. Of course, there always are. And the second one is this discrepancy between present self and future self. And it's part of the procrastination story. Oh, future self will do it. Future self hates present self for that. Shut up. I don't want to do it. I'm going to have more time pressure. But if you look ahead to future self, you say, I don't want to do that to future self. And on top of all that, when present self gets a bit done, we feel so good. Yeah. On a personal note, I start every morning. I'm up early. It's just my nature now. And I enjoy coffee, and I've cleaned the kitchen up, and I'm enjoying a coffee, and I reflect on my day, and I can reflect on what I accomplished yesterday. I look ahead, and I just get oriented about what's going on today. Right. And that's a great feeling. It grounds me in a very practical way. It's not the only thing I do, but it's part of that daily ritual.
Yeah, I love that. I have found that one of the things that I've done to cope with the busyness of the world is that I've identified that I've always been a sprinter. I've never been an endurance runner. And what I mean by that, even when I played sports, when I played soccer, I'm a sprinter. I could sprint as many times as you needed me to sprint in a game, but I
Mhm.
needed to take little breaks in between. I have to have pauses. I have to
Ah,
have breathing. I have to,
mhm.
I don't like to just keep running without feeling like we take a break and I look around for a second. Well,
Ah,
it took me many years to figure out that if you're a sprinter, I really feel like the turning point was again COVID. Waking up and having nothing I could do was the first. I couldn't go to the gym and see my trainer. I couldn't rush into the office. I couldn't, like, all those things. I woke up and I rolled over and I grabbed the Bible and I started reading scripture all the way through for the first time ever. I started slow. Then I
mhm.
built on that habit. And I've seen you in podcast reference The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of great Atomic Habits.
Mhm.
And then there's Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg. When
Yeah.
you start reading some of the stuff, what I did was I figured out that I needed to start slow so
Mhm.
I could think and plan. And then once I started sprinting, it just felt so good. So I could actually run. Once I get in here, I'll sprint all day. But
Yeah.
then I start to slow down as the day goes on. And by the time I walk in the door for my family, there's that breathing, there's that pause, there's that
Very nice.
moment. So
Mhm.
I
Mm.
feel like some of that has helped with the procrastination because it's actually allowed me to think through things I wasn't able. I was bypassing the thinking by staying so busy, which was the avoidance technique that you talked about.
Right. Big time there in terms of you started with habit. And of course, part of getting past the procrastination is to develop new habits. But to do that, you have to start small. And as Charles Duhigg has argued, you need those keystone habits, those little changes that pay off so much more because they have such big downstream effects. The other thing with habit, though, the flip side of habit is that procrastination becomes a bad habit. So, how do we get past that? How do we get off of autopilot? Well, one of the key things, and you saw that in the book, is something called implementation intentions. This is a concept created by Peter Gollwitzer and his colleagues and his students over decades now. And an implementation intention, as it sounds, is how you're going to implement your intentions, not just having a goal intention. So, I can have a goal intention to be more like Scott and run more. Although I got this arthritic hip that's not going to make that possible right now. But I have any goal you can think of. But a goal is just that. It's just this broad and sometimes anemic goal. The implementation intention to be most effective has a certain form. In situation X, I'm going to do behavior Y to achieve sub goal Z. I said it like an American. Instead of us Canadians, we'd say Z. Situation X, I do behavior Y. And you just keep it simple. Like, when I finish my coffee this morning, then I'm going to do this. And why do we do that? Because we put the stimulus for the action into the environment. Such a practical example that I've shared 1,000 times, if not more, is how I learned to floss my teeth. And because it just stood out to me as something I just never would do. And I'd always sing the procrastinator song. I don't feel like it. I don't want to. But I said to myself, I do brush my teeth. How am I going to floss? Okay, when I pick up my toothbrush, I'll put the floss on the counter. You see, now I've got something in my environment that reminds me, oh yeah, I'm going to put the floss on the counter. So that helps with prospective memory. When I put down my toothbrush, then I'll pick up my floss. Well, then I started to floss my teeth. Now I know some of your listeners are going, that's gross, man. You should floss your teeth before you brush. Well, I do that now. But you see, I had to harness where I was already at and establish a new habit. So we go full circle back to this notion of habit. So now I'm breaking a bad habit. How? Putting the cue into the environment. Now you can add on to that this notion of extended will. And that is that I use the environment around me to bolster my willpower. It's not just an internal thing. So I can do it. I'll go back to your example of running. Many people want to exercise more, but you get into your habitual routine of you say to yourself, "Well, I'd like to run in the morning," but in the morning you're at the coffee maker, and by then now you're doing your habit. So the night before, good self, motivated self, because self isn't going to do anything that night. It's about tomorrow's self. We like that best. Good self puts the running shoes right in front of the coffee maker. And you get to the coffee machine and go, oh yeah, I need to run. You see, now not only am I putting the stimulus into the environment, I'm starting to create the environment that starts to harness my goals. Oh yeah, those running shoes are there for a reason. I'm going to put them on now and get out the door. And if I can add one more thing to that, because they're always build on each other, is just kind of look at what's the next action. Because if I look at those shoes, I'm probably going to say to myself, I'm too tired this morning, or I'm too busy this morning, or you think there's a million excuses we're so good at it. Instead, just say, all I'm going to do is step out the door and start to walk, right? Just keep it simple. Don't think about the whole run. Just, I'm going to put the shoes on and step out the door. Now, the crazy thing about human beings is that, as the behavioral economists say, we are so predictably irrational that 10 minutes later, I'm sure I'm going to be running the Boston Marathon next year, right? Because now I'm out and I'm running. And that's the way the brain works, right? It's just constantly thinking, feeling, and we let it rule us too much. Yeah. So there's a bit of a riff on this notion of starting with habit, but then how do we not only establish new habits, but break bad habits? Yeah.
Yeah, I find anchoring it to something. BJ Fogg talks about this specifically in his Tiny Habits book, and anchoring it. One of my acquaintances and friends was telling a story. She's like 73 years old, and she wanted to start doing more push-ups. So she said, at 73, I go to the bathroom a lot. So I decided that I would do 5 push-ups every single time I went to the bathroom.
Perfect.
And she got to the point where she was doing, 5 turned into 7, 7 turned into 10. And it became a way to strengthen her mind and her body, and how
Yes.
that connection works. And you mentioned something else that I loved. And I felt like the inertia and movement was throughout. I mean, I even think you start with something your father used to tell you, which I'll let you say it, and then I'll give my point. What was that?
Well, it depends where, if you took it from the book or from my website most recently. My father's like, I'm redesigning my website because I've retired now. So it's no longer a research website. And my father used to say to me when I was younger, because I was quite a keen learner, especially when I was very much younger. My son's like that now. It's not just that you know something, son, it's what you do with it. That's one thing my father would say to me. And so that stuck with me. I thought, yeah, okay. And how is it going to, in a profound sense, in relation to the way you think about high performance life, in terms of love and impact and sorry, what's the F again?
Faith and energy.
And energy.
Yep.
This notion of, well, now I know something. How is it going to serve others? How is it going to make an impact? Right? It's not just me becoming a repository for all this stuff. So that's one of the things my dad used to say.
No, that's it.
Sure,
that's exactly what I was looking for, because at the end of the day, Nike doesn't have on their shirts, just know it. It's just do it.
Yes, and then Tim wants to take that further, though, because I don't want you to go too far with that. My big focus is on just get started. See, because sometimes if you say just do it, some people go, "Oh God, I can't." Like it's overwhelming.
I know.
So then I say, "Yeah, back it off a little bit. Just get started." Now I have to tell you that became a real mantra for me personally, and then after years of doing research and being pretty public about it, I've had people write to me and say, Dr. Pychyl, I really like your stuff, but if I could just get started, I wouldn't have a procrastination problem. Do you think you can do a little better than that? And that was a fair criticism, really, because I had so much in between the lines there, implicit in this just get started. So I went to David Allen. So many of your listeners have probably heard, because he's a guru for productivity. And he uses a wonderful expression, what's the next action? We don't do projects, we do action. So I took it down a notch and said, yeah, let's stand on David Allen's shoulders here and say, getting started means what's the next action? And you heard that implicitly earlier. I said, what's the next action? Just get out the door. Put the shoes on and just get out the door. The next step will take care of itself. Yeah. Yeah. So that's my dad was one of my favorite philosophers. Thanks for bringing him in.
Yeah, well, it's really cool. And I love it. And I think as a father of teenagers, I really have to think that one day my kids might quote something I say as valuable.
I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will.
I have some of their friends that will follow me on social media and like my stuff. And I'm always intrigued that my boys will occasionally do it. But you're really talking about something that I love. And it's not as simple as just do it, but it's really about the movement. And when you start moving, it's amazing how much better everything starts to flow. It creates that flow state. But there is such a discrepancy between getting started and doing it. And a lot of high performers actually have another level, and that is they don't do anything half-ass. They don't like to just do it. They like to do it to the up 10th degree. And so, when I do something, we just got through Lent, and I've grown up Catholic my whole life. And my youngest son, he went to Catholic school, still in Catholic school. he gives up the hardest stuff for children every year. And he has
Good for
that,
him.
brokenness that I think, I have with my neighbor and I who play professional baseball often call it a brokenness, because it's that extremism. It's almost like, I'm going to take the hardest thing. I'm going to prove to myself that I can do it. And then he does it. And so this year I gave up alcohol, which was something that I don't excessively do, but it's definitely something
Still
that I
nice to do
enjoy.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. It's a cleanse. But then I didn't just give up alcohol. I added like 12 more things because I was like, oh, I can do this. I can do that.
yeah.
And then it became so challenging that I felt like I was battling. But
Mm,
it was actually a really good learning. I like to learn from these self experiments. I like to do it. But high performers take something from getting started to just doing it, to what you said a few minutes ago, where when they start running, they think they're going to run the Boston Marathon. And
yes, yeah.
what advice do you have for that thought process?
Oh, wow. There's so much in there. I like the way you think. Um, I like the faith that you bring to it. Uh, you know, David Brooke has written a wonderful book, The Road to Character. And at the very end of that book, he says the section's called Stumblers. He said, I think something along the lines of, the good news about this book is that and you use this word, we're all broken, we're all stumblers. And I'm going to come back to that, because that's what I was thinking as you were talking about it, because we do want to set we do want to achieve as much as we can. I mean, that's fulfilling, but there's a fine line there, and it probably isn't as fine as I think it is, between that and perfectionism, right? And I like, that's why we're like the word broken. No one's perfect. And if you think about my favorite Canadian poet songwriter, Leonard Cohen, and his song Anthem, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And the problem, and we've seen this in research, that's a poetic way to think of it, but perfectionism is a big barrier, right? We think it's a good idea. And you describe self-oriented perfectionism. It's a dimension of perfectionism. And in fact, if I had to be a perfectionist, I have to admit that I am a bit, then that's probably the way to go. In fact, it doesn't seem to undermine our achievement very much. But many of us don't realize that we're also socially prescribed perfectionists. That is, we've internalized the standards and anticipate the evaluation of others. It's a conversation going in the back of our head, and that's crippling, right? It's a really horrible place to be. And then I go full circle to the story of, so why do we procrastinate? Because we have this amygdala hijack. We have this emotional response that we cope with by avoidance. Well, perfectionism sets us up for that, because you're ruminating on other people's standards and expectations for you, and now that becomes a barrier for action. So you have to be careful that it's great to strive for better, getting to better, but see, better isn't perfect, and there's a big gap there. And I think everyone needs to be aware of that, especially high performers. In fact, I told you in passing that I've been invited to work with people, and I thought, what in the world am I going to say to these people that would have any relevance? Like, they're just so accomplished. Well, what do they pay attention most to? The stuff on perfectionism, and then the flip side of that, self-forgiveness. And the base for self-forgiveness is self-compassion. And many of them will tell me, I've got a good friend. I won't say how I know him because it might identify him too much, but he is so talented. Like, he's a medical professional. He's an incredible athlete, but he drives himself so hard. Why? Because he doesn't offer himself any self-compassion, and he's got attitudes that stand in the way of it. And in fact, Fuchsia Sirwa at Durham University in the UK just published a paper to show that attitudes like that reduce the likelihood that we're going to be self-compassionate. And if you can't be self-compassionate, you can't offer yourself self-forgiveness. And if you can't offer yourself self-forgiveness, you're not even part of the human race, because we're not perfect. Now, there's a earful.
No, it's great, because I think that brokenness, we'll come back to that. That brokenness is really identifying that everything we do is going to have imperfection in it. And so, it's interesting because, I talked about love, impact, faith, and energy. And the one that gets everybody the most uncomfortable is when I bring up faith. And it's because everybody bases faith on perfection. And the key component is, it's the very reason, the very thing that's allowed me to actually have a little bit more forgiveness is
Yes.
actually separating from self. It's getting out of the way of thinking
Yes.
I can control everything and
Yes.
allowing it to be a higher power. And
Yeah.
I don't, the brokenness, the interesting thing is my sons, and I watch them, they're 13 and 16, they'll be 14 and 17 in a month.
Mhm.
And one of the things I tend to be most proud of as a father today, and it doesn't mean they'll always do it, is that they don't seem to have, they have the intensity in action, but they don't have the intensity in lead up and follow and ending. And what I mean by that
Mm.
is I come from the, if I'm going to play you in a game mentality, I want to win.
Mhm.
I'm already thinking about how I'm going to beat you. I'm already thinking about how bad I beat you at the end. And if I lost, I'm internalizing what I could have done better. My boys have a great way of having the intensity in the right moments and understanding that the result is uncontrollable
Mm.
after you put all of your action into it. And I struggle with that a
Right.
lot of times. And I think a lot of our listeners struggle with that. And we find ourselves, just because you struggle with it at one time doesn't mean you aren't 80%, 90% better, but there's still 10% of the time, like your friend, where you might be, it's, you said perfection is dangerous, right? Well,
Mhm.
when you know something can be better, this is an
Mhm.
entrepreneur's brain. Like the
Right.
minute I know that good is something that could be just a little bit better,
It's
I mean,
okay.
oh
Yeah.
man, I'm like, oh,
But
we could
but
change that.
but it's perfect that is what undermines us. Like better is always possible.
Right.
And but there's this notion of good enough. But I like to come back to the idea of faith. What the connotation for me immediately is different than what others say. For me, faith has the connotation of redemption, and that's why you find the self-forgiveness in there. And I think that's crucial, right? That so if we're going to talk about perfectionism, we have to open ourselves up to that we're all part of our common humanity. We're all part of the human race, and no one is perfect. And in that comes self-compassion, and in that, in a profound way, comes redemption. You know, to recognize that we have made mistakes and we are not perfect, but that doesn't mean we have to repeat that. And in fact, if I can riff on that a little further, you know, one of my favorite mantras to get me past my own procrastination, besides what's the next action, that's crucial. I use that constantly, you know, because I'll face a task and I'll go, oh, I don't even know what to do. Tim, what's the next action? Make it small, stay in the game. So that's really powerful. And I hope people hang on to that and say, yeah, I learned something from that Pychyl guy. But another thing is about emotion regulation, which I've been stressing. And this comes from Parker Palmer, who is a Quaker, and he's a man of faith in a deep way. And if you don't know Parker Palmer, it's worth spending some time. Your listeners could spend time getting to know him. He's got a lot to offer. But he, in one of his books, The Courage to Teach, that I enjoyed back in the late 90s, early 2000s, because that's when he wrote it. He's written many other books. But he wrote, you know, I can have fear, but I needn't be my fear because I can work from some other part of my inner landscape. Because my inner landscape includes many other things about me. Now you can broaden that and say, I can have an emotion. I don't have to be that emotion. And I do that all day long. I combine his Christianity, his Quakerism, with, say, Joseph Goldstein's Buddhism. And Joseph Goldstein will add, you know, it's okay to feel that way. Oh boy, those are two powerful statements for me. I can have a feeling without being that feeling, and it's okay to feel this way. And when I do that, and I take that deep breath that I talked about earlier, now I've calmed down the amygdala. I've calmed myself down, and I'm willing to try again.
Yeah.
And you see how all these pieces come together. That's why I call it solving the procrastination puzzle, because all of these pieces have to come together to solve that puzzle. The little things like what's the next action, the deeper things like, geez, faith and redemption, absolutely. And then this whole notion that I have to accept my common humanity. Yeah, you do. I thought this was just about time management. No, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much depth to it. I mean, it's interesting as you were talking about the imperfection piece, and how people really almost try to hide that part of them, right? And it's what we all are searching for is a deeper connection to the next human, to our families, to love in some capacity, right? And your deepest connections come from sharing imperfections. You often find your deepest friendships, your deepest, I've had this realization recently, and I'll pause because I know you have something to add to this, but I'm 44. I'll be 45 in a couple months. And gosh, I wish I thought like this when I was 25, but the brain has just expanded in ways I never dreamed. And what I've loved most is when we talk about connection, recently, some of my very best friends from my earliest days have become so important to me at this point in time in my life. They have come back into my life in moments that are just so perfect. We had so many different paths. And, I had one of my best friends from high school came over. He's watching all my son's high school games. He used to watch me play, and he's sitting next to me on the stands during these moments. Just having him next to me. We have different worlds, different lives, different interests, but man, the unifying factors of our imperfections and how we grew up is the deepest connection that you can share with somebody. And I am so grateful to be able to see some of that come full circle, but it wouldn't be happening if I didn't hold on, and we didn't hold on to those friendships, even loosely, and B, we didn't acknowledge the imperfections that kind of make us vulnerable. Like,
Yes. I wondered
that's
when
the
you were going to
key.
get to that word.
Vulnerability.
Exactly.
Vulnerability. I was going to get there. It takes a long time for me. I'm 44, remember?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go over all those. I knew you were going to get there, and I just was waiting for it to come out, because men in particular have a tough time being vulnerable, right? And I remember your story is so beautiful, because I remember one of my closest friends in the world since high school. We don't see each other very much because we live far away, but we connected because we admitted our own fears and insecurities as young men. And I can remember the moment I said, "You feel that way too?" It was like a light went on. Like, I'm not alone in these feelings. And forever since then, we've been each other's best men and all that sort of thing, because we connected that way, and that acknowledging that imperfection, for sure. I wish I was 44 again. I'm 67, going to be 68. You've learned a lot of things really early in life. As much as you might have liked to learn them at 20, I think we all would have. You've still got a leg up way earlier than so many of us. Yeah, I'm very impressed.
Well, I feel blessed. I feel blessed to have failed so often. I feel blessed to have
Yes.
learned from the earlier versions of me, that, the knowing that there's better. And I've never been a perfection seeker. I've always been a seeker of I want it to be as great as possible, but I'm also okay if it's not. And I get better with that with age. But most of us, we just see the former version of ourselves, and we have a tendency to go back to that version. When it comes to procrastination, I'm interested, how many people break their biggest procrastination habits and revert back to going through them again on a regular basis? Is there research that talks about that, how often they repeat the cycle, or do they break the cycle and that movement kind of moves them further up the continuum? Is that a valid question?
It's a good question, and unfortunately, there's not a good research-based answer. There's so much more research needs to be done to answer that question. But I think I'd take a broader perspective on an answer for that, and that is, I think a lot of people want to feel like they're past it, they've healed, right? They're never going to have to struggle again. No, I think we have to embrace the struggle and know that we have the strategies to succeed again today. Not worry about tomorrow, that I did it today, but I'm going to screw up tomorrow. That's pretty human as well, because we ruminate about past mistakes, and we live in fear about what could be in the future. Well, both of those are so unhealthy. And so instead, we have to have the faith that the tools that help me today will help me tomorrow. And one of the things we know, like Dan Gilbert's research and Timothy Wilson, wonderful stuff about behavioral economics and how we think about future self. And we don't take into account how things are going to be different in the future. And one of the things that's going to be different in the future is I'm going to have more skills. I'm going to be in a different context, and just have faith that all of that, because I'm doing better today, I'm going to be doing better tomorrow. But it's not like it's going to go away. And if I go back to Parker Palmer for a minute, I remember as a younger teacher reading his work, and he'd been in this game for a long time. And he wrote something like, I remember dreaming one day that perhaps when I got to be in my 50s, I would no longer have the fears I have about entering in the classroom and doing this job. And that was just the wrong wish. It was just, it's never going to happen, right? We're always going to live with the existential reality of human relations, of the difficulty in doing tasks and facing ourselves every day. So procrastination doesn't necessarily go away as a temptation, like any temptations do,
Right.
but you can successfully deal with it much better, and you can live in that faith. Yeah.
Yeah. To take us full circle, when you actually incorporate some of that discipline and you start to break it down into simpler forms, and it just becomes the next action and movement begins, procrastination will be less and less in our lives. And it's also about prioritization. We talked earlier about love, impact, faith, and energy. And when you prioritize the most important things, who are the most important people that you surround yourself with? Are they because you love them? Are they because you admire what they do? Are they because they're the best at what they do and it's all about your impact? I've always found it really interesting that, you tend to really maybe dial back. And I don't know if this is real or not. This is a thought I had when I was reading your work, but I tend to dial back procrastination when I'm dialed into something I love, something that I really am impassioned about. And so I can find a reason to stop everything and do something if it means so much to me. And so sometimes life is just a matter of reprioritizing, and we haven't done it in so long that it becomes very difficult to we're hard on ourselves about something that maybe we just need to re-examine. And to go back to your point, pause, think, breathe, and see what happens. I mean, I find that interesting with procrastination. I bet you if the more impassioned someone is, the less likely they are to pause or to wait.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I never thought of it that way. The more impassioned they are, the less likely they are to pause or wait. It is a learned skill, and you might get caught up and not slow down and pause and wait. But you know that when you say pause and wait and think, I know that there's research, and this is near and dear to my heart, that the more mindful we are, the less we procrastinate. And that if someone asks me, so how do I develop these skills, especially around emotion regulation? Well, I would focus on a mindfulness meditation habit. It would be one of the many things that I make as a daily practice. And it may embody prayer, right? That might be the way that it's embodied in your life, but it might be more secular, and it might be more a true meditation process, practice. But the notion there, and I use that word practice, is an important one. It's something we do all the time because it's what keeps us grounded. It's what keeps us in the present moment. And it allows us to, and this is what you learned from, examine our lives, right? Look at my mistakes, accept them. Allow them, again, for listeners who may be not familiar with a mindfulness meditation, you might want to look at Tara Brach, for example, and her wonderful acronym of RAIN. So we recognize how we're feeling. We allow those feelings. We investigate them. We just feel them in our body. And then finally, we nurture ourselves. So these are habits that, as much as they seem tangential, they are really, I think, part of the whole solution to procrastination.
Yeah, it's so good. It's really so intriguing. I could talk about this all day because this is something else I really love about exploring the podcast. Sometimes I run a business and I am busy like always, but this is something that I've carved out to be able to be a part of my week every single week. And I look forward to the conversations because it sparks my brain to think in ways I've never thought before. It drives a new book, a mention of a person I've never followed, something that intrigues me to explore a different path that helps in that attainment of what I'm working towards, which is just a better version of myself every day. And I think that's who the listeners that listen to this, we're going to continue to do the things that we do, but procrastination can be a little less of a part of it if we implement the things that you're teaching.
Yeah, I think so. Because I've tried to be very practical, but I have to say that, you'd focused on meaning a moment ago, and absolutely we have research to show that it's always a trade-off between this, or a balance between meaning and manageability. If I don't know why I'm doing it, I probably won't do it. But if I don't know how to do it, I won't. So we're always asking ourselves these two questions: why, what's the meaning, and how? And some days they both seem out of control and a bit chaotic. But again, we're going back to high performance life, love, impact, faith, and energy. It there are the components to the procrastination puzzle solution as well, particularly that first one, because not only a better version of yourself, but I know that implicit in that is a better version of yourself in relation to others. That, and that's crucial. You can't define the self apart from who we are with other people, and that's why the next is impact, and then the next is faith, because that is the foundation for those loving relations and the impact that we have on others. And finally, in an ironic sense, you would think that my whole focus would be on energy, because so many people say, well, I procrastinate because I just don't have the energy. Well, you're going to see that love and impact and faith actually feed that back end of energy. When you have those things working for you, when you're in relationship, both with others and yourself, the energy's there, right? Yeah, you're not ruminating anymore. You're showing up. You're feeling more, quote, authentic. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually use each of them to help the other. And so, for example, you talk about this. I've heard multiple times about weight loss and how people struggle with the best version of themselves as healthy, right? They know they should eat something different. They're going to bypass they're going to eat the salads. They can have the donut later, and all these types of things that you've referenced. But I often use my quadrants of love, right? Who are the people that I want to be alive for? How can my future self be a better version for those people? I can't serve and help more people. I can't be a better father. I can't be a partner to my wife if I'm not healthy. And so sometimes it's easier for some of us to do the body and the spirit. Sometimes it's harder for the mind. For me, it's slowing down the mind. That's what I've had to work on a little bit more because of the speed. And I talk about procrastination. I wrote meditation in as a goal of mine for probably 2 or 3 years. When I would work through, I brain dump in each of the categories. So I go to love, who are the people that are most important to me, and I write everything that's in my brain about those people. And this is my process, and I do it for impact and what's going on at work, what's going on in the world. Am I giving of myself the way I want? Faith, what do I want to do? And you get to energy. I wrote down meditation probably for 2 to 3 years and circled it as one of the top priorities, and did it like once and then stopped and then did it once. And then my friend Jason Campbell, I was at a Genius Network meeting with Joe Polish and a couple people, and Jason Campbell and I started at the same time in this. And he's just a major, he's actually sold more spiritual meditation music. He's a Billboard like machine. But the guy, he just looked at me, he was like, Scott, do 5 minutes a day, do 1 minute a day, whatever it is. And I did 1 minute a day. And he goes, just do 1 minute a day. I did 1 minute a day. Then it got to 5 minutes. Then it got to 10 minutes. So I see him a year later. I'm like, Jason, you tricked me. You knew that when I did 1, it wasn't going to be enough, and I needed to do 5. And then when I did 5, I did 10. It helped build the areas of my life that I wasn't as good at, but procrastination's always a part of it, and we all experience it.
Yes, that's a great example. And for me, I can face the same thing. I really need my yoga in my life, because I told you I'm going to be 68. I've got a little arthritis in my right hip, particularly now. I got to do it more than ever. And I can get to the point any day, and I love how I feel after yoga, but I look at the mat curled up. I go, I don't want to. I don't feel like it. There's the procrastinator song. I say, Tim, just roll out the mat and stand on it. You don't have to go any further. You see how we can go full cycle in this whole thing? And of course, then I do it and I feel better, and I can celebrate. I can pause, as we talked about earlier, celebrate that success. And then ultimately what really matters is then I think I'm being the person I want to be. Right. And that feels so good, as opposed to the guy that goes to bed and say, in your case, I didn't meditate today, or in my case, I didn't get on the yoga mat. Right. And we all face that. And as your listeners have been listening along, they've substituted their own project that always seems to fall off the edge. They need to find that little first step. And you've mentioned some great books that way, whether it's Duhigg or Atomic Habits by
James Clear, and then Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg. All three kind of just same mentality, but just different versions.
That's right. And many of them will have the same skills involved, in fact. So yeah, well, it's been great. Like I just feeding on your energy, Scott. It's really wonderful to meet you today.
I love it. I'm so grateful. I'm going to end it here, but the next time we talk, we're going to talk, because I got to set up another time in the future, but I want to talk with you about ADHD. I want to talk to you about the value of self-awareness in procrastination. And I want to hit on goals and dreams in the future. So all the listeners, stay tuned. It may not happen right away, but in the future, we're definitely going to have another conversation. Dr. Tim, how do we find your stuff? You're in a revamp. You've retired from teaching only in the formal version. Now you're taking it to a wisdom version of really sharing it to the world. How do people find you? How do they listen to you? How can we get more of this type of conversation?
Well, you can go to procrastination.ca. It's not procrastination.com. .ca is the first two letters in Canada, because I'm a Canadian. So procrastination.ca. I was a really early adopter of technology for teaching and learning, and I got that domain name back in 1995. So it's mine. And so if you go there, you'll see, you're right, it's in transition, but you'll learn a bit. You'll see some of the things we've done as studies, and you'll see other podcast interviews I've done. Back in 2006, I began my own podcast. I invite you to go listen if you'd like, but just know that those early years, most of us hadn't figured out these wonderful things called microphones, and there's some very bad audio quality, but excellent guests. So if you really do want to do more that way, and I did write a blog for Psychology Day from 2008 until about 2019. I had a oropharyngeal cancer in 2019. Threw me for a loop. That's why I keep sipping on water. I had a throat cancer. So it changed things, and I haven't been doing as many podcasts. But that's how you'd learn more about my work if you'd like to learn more. But I give you a warning that you can procrastinate by trying to learn more about procrastination and feel justified in doing it. So if you're going to dive in there, do it in small bits and focus on implementing things. If you just take a couple of the things that we've talked about today and bring them into your life, it can make all the difference if you want it to.
Yeah, and this is Dr. Tim Pychyl's book, and the key thing you'll notice here, it's not very thick. If you're watching us on YouTube, it is potent and broken down in the easiest of forms. And when you've taught college for so long, you have to become an expert at simplifying the challenging, and you certainly are. I'm grateful for the conversation. I'm grateful that my brain had the ability to spark in so many ways today with you as a guest, and the energy was amazing. So stay tuned. We have way more to come, and I look forward to everything you're accomplishing in the future. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's really been a pleasure. Yeah, and thanks for putting up with the construction work outside, the dogs barking. It's just been a zoo and a circus, but it's been great to be together with you.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked it, there's more where this one came from. Click here and enjoy some more.